The dinner party was extravagant, luxurious chandeliers, casting soft, golden light over a long, polished mahogany table, surrounded by the most powerful people in the room. Billionaires, millionaires, business moguls, men and women who had amassed more wealth than most could ever dream of. But there, tucked away in a corner, sitting by his mother, Marcus, a young black boy, shifted uneasily in his seat. His mother, a maid in one of the wealthiest homes in the city, had brought him along to this gathering, a reminder of her humble position in a world that barely acknowledged their existence. The laughter of the elite filled the air as they discussed their latest accomplishments and philosophies on education, life, and what made someone truly great. Marcus, eyes wide, tried to absorb it, all wondering what it must feel like to be one of them, to move through the world with such power, such privilege. As they spoke of real education, it became clear that it was a conversation far removed from his own reality. He felt out of place, like an outsider in a world that had no room for him. Then, Richard, a smug billionaire with a wide grin and a sharp tongue, turned his attention to Marcus. "What do you know about the world, young man?" Richard said casually, his voice laced with condescension. "Let's test your knowledge, huh? Answer me this. What's the root cause of the French Revolution?" The entire table fell silent, a momentary hush hanging in the air. All eyes turned to Marcus, who felt the weight of the question hit him like a ton of bricks. Marcus froze. The laughter died. His palms went clammy. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't like them. But Richard's smirk grew wider, his challenge hanging in the air like a trap. "You gonna answer, or are we just going to sit here waiting for you to fail?" Richard pressed on, leaning back in his chair. The billionaires around him chuckled, clearly enjoying the spectacle. The pressure was unbearable. Marcus glanced at his mother, her face filled with a mix of fear and embarrassment, her eyes begging for him to get it right, to somehow prove that he was worth something in this room of powerful strangers. But no answer came. No words formed in his mouth. He was nothing more than a boy to them, small, invisible, out of place. The laughter came, soft at first, then louder, filling the room with a cruel echo. "I knew it," Richard muttered under his breath, his smug grin never leaving his face. A servant boy should know his place. Marcus's heart raced as the mocking voices drowned out his thoughts. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he considered shrinking back into the shadows, fading from their view, from their ridicule. But something shifted inside of him. Something deep and quiet, like a flicker of light in a dark room. The question, the laughter, it all turned into a blur. But Marcus's thoughts were sharp. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "You can be anything, even if they can't see it." The memory of his father's words stirred a fire inside of him, fire that refused to be extinguished. Marcus stood up. His legs were shaky, but his spine was straight. He turned to face Richard, locking eyes with the billionaire. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The men waited for the boy to crumble. But Marcus wasn't crumbling anymore. "You want to test me, all right?" Marcus's voice was steady, unwavering. He felt a calmness settle over him, like a shield against the hostility around him. Richard's grin faltered for a moment, confusion flashing in his eyes. But Marcus wasn't done. He took a breath, then spoke. His words came slowly at first, but they gained momentum with each sentence. His answer wasn't just about the French Revolution, it was about the world itself. He spoke of history in a way the billionaires had never heard, weaving the past with present struggles. He spoke of the disenfranchised, the forgotten, the underdogs who had fought against systems built to oppress them. His voice grew stronger, more powerful with every word. He wasn't just answering a question. He was speaking truths that had been silenced for far too long. And Richard, the great Richard, the powerful, wealthy man who thought himself untouchable, sat in stunned silence. The room full of men who believed they knew everything was now silent. Marcus wasn't just answering questions. He was turning their world upside down. He wasn't the servant. He wasn't the invisible boy. He was the one with the knowledge. He was the one who had always known. The billionaires around the table shifted uneasily in their seats. They couldn't look away. Every word Marcus spoke shattered their perceptions, their assumptions, his insights, his intelligence. It was like a flood of truth they hadn't been prepared for. Richard's smirk vanished completely. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by something else, something that looked like respect, like realization. Marcus's mother stood in the corner, her face wet with tears. She wasn't ashamed of her son. She was overwhelmed by the strength she saw in him. The boy who had been humiliated, who had felt small, he wasn't small anymore. He had proven them all wrong. The dinner went on, but the atmosphere was different now. The billionaires were no longer laughing. The mood had shifted. Marcus had exposed something that couldn't be unseen. Richard, no longer the king of the room, felt something deep in his chest, an uncomfortable, unshakable feeling. The night came to an end. The guests stood and began to filter out, but Marcus's mother didn't move. She couldn't move. She had watched her son, her baby, become something more than what anyone had ever expected. Richard approached Marcus slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by a newfound humility. He reached out his hand. But Marcus, with quiet dignity, shook his head. "I don't need your approval," Marcus said softly, but with a strength that filled the room. "I'm enough as I am." The room went quiet. The billionaires, the powerful men who had once believed they could define worth with their wealth, now stood frozen, stunned by the boy's simple truth. Marcus didn't need them. He didn't need their approval, their wealth, or their validation. His strength, his worth, came from within. The boy who had been humiliated, who had been made to feel small, had just shown them all that his value was immeasurable. As Marcus left the mansion, his mother followed him, her heart swelling with pride. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a young man, and he had shown the world that true worth isn't defined by wealth. It's defined by the strength of your spirit and the wisdom you carry within, and that lesson would stay with them forever. The silence in the room hung like a thick fog after Marcus's response. The billionaires, too stunned to speak, their eyes glued to him. Marcus stood there, chest heaving, the weight of Richard's questions still pressing on him. But now he felt something different, something fierce building inside him. It was like the room had shrunk, and in that moment, he wasn't just some boy in the corner. He was the center of attention, the nucleus of something much bigger. His words had rattled their foundations, and now they waited for the next move. Richard was the first to break the silence. The smirk that had once been a permanent fixture on his face faded, replaced with a look of confusion. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Marcus, someone who wasn't supposed to know the things Marcus knew. His hand tightened around the glass of champagne he had been sipping moments before. The laughter had died down, but the underlying mockery still lingered in the air like a stifled sneeze, waiting to explode. Okay, Richard said, his voice an awkward attempt at regaining control. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, and for a brief second, Marcus saw the predatory gleam that lurked beneath his polished exterior. "Let's see if you can really answer this one, then." Something a little more, challenging. The other men leaned in, intrigued by Richard's challenge. They didn't expect the boy to rise to the occasion. They expected him to falter again. They wanted him to fail. The question that followed wasn't the simple historical query it seemed. It was a complex, multi-layered problem, one that demanded not just knowledge but the kind of wealth-based perspective they were all familiar with. It wasn't about what Marcus knew. It was about how much he could show he belonged in their world. "You know, son," Richard said, his tone suddenly patronizing, "life is more than books. You have to understand the systems, the structures, the rules." He glanced at his friends, who chuckled in quiet agreement. "Tell me, what makes a system work?" How does power flow? The question was loaded, not just with complexity, but with the subtle implication that Marcus could never understand the intricacies of power that these men lived by. Every day, Marcus stood motionless, his mind racing. His mother, standing by the wall near the edge of the room, watched him with wide eyes. She could see the tension building within her son. She could feel it. She knew what it was like to be looked down upon, to be underestimated, to be invisible in a world that told you your value was less than zero. But this was different. This was her son, her pride, and she could see he wasn't just about to shrink in the face of the question. He wasn't just going to sit back and be the punchline of their joke. His palms began to sweat, but Marcus didn't back down. He locked eyes with Richard, refusing to look away, refusing to let them see the fear in him. He was different now. Something had shifted inside him. He wasn't some pawn in their game anymore. He wasn't a servant. He wasn't invisible. He was going to answer, even if it was hard, even if it meant he had to challenge the very system they took for granted. You think power is about wealth? Marcus began, his voice calm but steady. You think it's about what you can buy, who you can control? But power is in something deeper. Power is in knowledge. It's in the way a person can look at the world and see it for what it really is, not what people want you to believe it is. The billionaires shifted uneasily in their seats. Marcus's words weren't just answers, they were truths that struck at the core of what they believed. They were uncomfortable truths, the kind that didn't fit the narrative they had built for themselves. Richard's jaw clenched as he tried to regain his composure, but the power dynamic was beginning to shift in a way he didn't expect. Marcus continued, his voice rising with a quiet authority, one that had never been there before. The system works by keeping people like me in the dark. You tell us that we don't know enough, that we're not smart enough, that we don't have the right resources. But what you don't realize is that knowledge doesn't belong to the rich. It belongs to everyone. And when you use your knowledge to build walls and keep people out, you forget that those walls can come down. And when they do, it's not just you who's in control anymore. The room was now silent. The billionaires, once so certain of their superiority, were now hanging on Marcus's every word. His mother, too, was speechless, tears welling up in her eyes. This wasn't just her son answering questions. This was her son flipping the script. Richard's face had drained of color. The smugness, the arrogance, all of it was gone. It was replaced with something that looked almost like fear. He wasn't afraid of Marcus in the way one might be afraid of a physical threat. No, it was something deeper. It was the fear of realizing that Marcus had just shown him, and everyone else in the room, that true power doesn't lie in money or status. It lies in the ability to see the world for what it truly is and to act on it. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. The billionaires exchanged glances, none of them daring to break the silence. Richard's eyes flickered toward his friends, his old allies, but they didn't know what to say. They had come here expecting to laugh at the boy, to poke fun at him for his lack of real education. But they had underestimated him. They had underestimated the power that comes with a person who knows their worth, who has the courage to stand up and speak the truth. Marcus's words hung in the air like a challenge to their entire existence. The room had been turned upside down. The billionaires were no longer the powerful ones. Marcus had flipped the power dynamic, and now they were the ones who had to sit with the discomfort of their own ignorance. For the first time that evening, they were the ones feeling small. They were the ones who had been humiliated not by the boy's failure, but by his strength, his dignity, and the unwavering confidence in his words. They were the ones who had been put in their place. Marcus stood taller now. His chest swelled, but not with pride. He wasn't doing this for them. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone except himself. In this moment, he had shown that no matter how much money or power someone has, they can never take away what a person knows what a person is truly capable of. The quiet lingered in the room. Richard tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The billionaires, once so quick to dismiss Marcus, now seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. This wasn't the moment they thought it would be. It wasn't the show they expected. It was the beginning of something far more profound, something that couldn't be ignored, and Marcus, with quiet strength, turned away from them. It wasn't about winning. It was about understanding the truth that he was enough. He was always enough, and no one, not even the wealthiest man in the room, could ever take that away from him. The tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate. Marcus stood in the midst of the billionaires, his words still echoing through the room, and yet it wasn't enough. He could feel the weight of their stares on his back, the awkward silence wrapping itself around him like a heavy cloak. It wasn't just the guests at the table who were quiet. The entire mansion seemed to hold its breath. The laughter, the mockery, everything that had filled the space moments before was now gone, replaced with something else, something heavier, something unsettling. Richard, who had once towered over him like an unshakable force, now stood frozen, his expression unreadable. But even in the silence, Marcus could feel Richard's need to regain control, to twist the situation back in his favor. But it wasn't working. Marcus wasn't the scared boy he had been just a moment ago. He wasn't invisible anymore. Still, something gnawed at him. The discomfort in the room, it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. It felt like an invitation, a challenge. But this time, it wasn't from Richard. It was from within. Marcus's mind raced. His father's words echoed in his head, over and over. You can be anything, even if they can't see it. What did that mean? What did it truly mean to be anything in this world when the world, time and time again, had made it clear you were nothing? Richard finally broke the silence, his voice tight, almost forced. I didn't mean to embarrass you, boy. The words slipped from his lips with a casualness that felt like a slap. I was just making a point. He was trying to regain his earlier bravado, but it rang hollow. The words were weak, laced with an unspoken apology that couldn't mask the arrogance beneath. But Marcus wasn't buying it. Not anymore. Richard's attempt to smooth over the tension only made things worse. The other billionaires, who had been so eager to mock Marcus earlier, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They exchanged glances, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truth that was slowly creeping into their minds. They weren't better than him, not by a long shot. Marcus took a step forward, locking eyes with Richard. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. He wasn't going to let them keep treating him like an object of mockery, like something beneath them. No, Marcus said softly, his voice unwavering. The room went still. You didn't embarrass me. You embarrassed yourself. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice. His confidence, quiet and steady, was more than enough to dismantle Richard's facade. The billionaires around the table shifted, uneasily now, as if suddenly realizing the weight of what had just been said. They were used to wielding their wealth like a weapon, used to being the ones in control. But what Marcus had just done wasn't about wealth. It was about power. True power. Power that came from within, from knowing your worth in a world that tried to make you forget it. Richard's face tightened. The self-assured grin he'd worn earlier was gone. In its place, a frown marred his brow, his jaw clenched in frustration. For a moment, he looked as if he was about to lash out. But then something in his eyes changed. Something that wasn't just anger. Something darker. It was the realization that he wasn't in control anymore. The truth was, he never had been. Marcus had shattered something in that moment. Something that went beyond their conversation. Beyond their tests and challenges. Richard's world, his sense of superiority, had been torn apart by the very boy he had tried to dismiss. The silence stretched, and Marcus could feel the shift in the room. The billionaires were no longer just watching him with amusement. They were watching him with something else now, something he couldn't quite name, but it was there, in their eyes. Something they couldn't deny, something they hadn't expected. Richard cleared his throat, the sound harsh, like sandpaper scraping against wood. "You know," he began, his voice sounding smaller than before, "maybe I was wrong, maybe I didn't give you enough credit." The words were an apology. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the armor he'd worn so confidently. It wasn't the grand, sweeping confession Marcus had hoped for, but it was a start, and for Marcus, that was enough. He wasn't doing this for Richard. He wasn't doing this to get approval or validation from any of these men. He was doing this for himself. "I'm not here for your approval," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm. "I don't need it. I never did." Richard's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something resembling respect crossing his features before he quickly masked it. But it was too late. Marcus had already seen it, and it was enough. The rest of the room remained quiet. No one dared to speak. The billionaires, who had come to this dinner thinking they would enjoy a night of easy superiority, now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Marcus, once invisible in their eyes, was now someone they couldn't ignore. His quiet strength had broken through their walls, and for the first time that evening, they were the ones who felt small. Marcus didn't need to say anything more. He had already won, not by outsmarting them or proving them wrong, but by showing them that true power doesn't lie in how much money you have or how many people you can control. True power lies in the ability to stand tall in the face of disrespect, to hold your head high when the world tries to tell you that you don't matter. It lies in knowing your worth, regardless of what anyone else thinks. As Marcus turned to leave the room, his mother followed him. She didn't need words to say what she felt. She was proud, so proud of the young man her son had become, even if the world hadn't seen him for who he truly was until now. Richard stood there, his hand still hanging in the air as if waiting for Marcus to turn back and shake it. But Marcus didn't. He didn't need to. He had already shown the world that he was more than they had ever imagined, more than they would ever understand. The billionaires, now left in the silence of their own making, began to murmur among themselves. They had been tested, and they had failed. But Marcus had passed, and the world would never look at him the same way again. The night was almost over, but the atmosphere in the mansion was no longer the same. The laughter that had once filled the room now felt hollow, almost like it had been erased from existence. The billionaires stood in a tight, uneasy cluster near the grand windows, their hushed conversations punctuated by awkward glances toward Marcus, who had long since left the center of attention. The power dynamic had shifted in a way no one could have anticipated, and now, in the silence that followed, it was as though the weight of the evening's events was settling over them all. Marcus stood beside his mother near the exit. The flicker of pride in her eyes, the softness in her gaze, made his heart swell. She didn't say a word, but he didn't need her to. He could feel it, in the way she looked at him. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. This was the moment when she finally saw that her son had become more than just a boy in the corner, more than just a servant's child. He had become something bigger, something stronger, something undeniable. And in that silence, Richard, once the unquestioned king of the room, moved toward Marcus. His posture was different now. The arrogant swagger, the smug smirk, all of it had been wiped away, replaced with something that looked eerily like humility. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice quiet, hesitant. For a moment, he seemed almost ... human. "I didn't realize." The words hung in the air, awkward and clumsy. There was no grand apology. There was no grand revelation on Richard's part. But what was there, what Marcus could sense in the billionaire's eyes, was something else. Something deeper than mere words. Richard was seeing something he hadn't seen before. He was seeing Marcus not as a child to be humiliated, not as a symbol of the people beneath him, but as a person, a human being, a force to be reckoned with. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, his gaze steady, unwavering. His heart didn't race. It didn't swell with pride. It was something else, something more grounded, more rooted. "I don't need your validation, Richard," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I never did." The words seemed to land in the room like a stone dropped in water, rippling outward, making everyone feel the weight of what was being said. Richard's face flushed slightly, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he extended his hand, though it felt more like an offering than the power move it had been earlier. The gesture was a sign of respect, of acknowledgement, but Marcus quietly, firmly shook his head, refusing the gesture. "You don't get to decide what I am," Marcus continued, his voice unwavering, echoing in the quiet. "I already know who I am, and I don't need your approval to be who I am. Not now, not ever." For a moment, Richard seemed lost for words. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again, as though the weight of Marcus's words had rendered him speechless. He stood there, hands still extended, but this time the offer felt like something more fragile, something broken. Marcus didn't look at him with anger. He didn't look at him with disdain. He looked at him with something more powerful, understanding. He understood now what the rich often overlooked, what they couldn't see, even with all their wealth. They thought power was something you could buy. They thought respect was something you could demand with money, with status, with control. But Marcus knew the truth. True power wasn't something that could be bought. True power was earned, with dignity, with strength, and, above all, with knowledge of self. Richard finally lowered his hand, not in defeat, but in a moment of quiet recognition. He didn't say anything. There was no applause, no grand gesture. But something had changed, something deep and irreversible. The billionaires around them, who had once looked at Marcus with disdain, now looked at him with a different kind of awareness. They couldn't ignore him anymore. They couldn't unsee him, and they realized, whether they liked it or not, that they were never the ones who held all the cards. Not anymore. Marcus turned to his mother, who had been watching silently, her face full of pride, her eyes glistening with tears. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to tell him how proud she was. She didn't need to speak the words, because she knew. She knew this moment wasn't just about proving something to the billionaires. It was about Marcus proving something to himself. He had stood tall in a room full of powerful men, who thought they had the right to belittle him. He had faced their mockery and their disdain, and he had turned it all into strength. He had shown them that no matter how much money they had, no matter how many connections they wielded, they couldn't define him. He had shown them that their wealth and power meant nothing compared to the power of knowing who you are, and standing firm in that truth. Richard's words from earlier, "I didn't realize," echoed in the silence. He hadn't realized what? That Marcus was worthy of respect, that he had the same right to walk through this world with dignity, no matter his background. That knowledge wasn't a privilege for the wealthy to hoard, but a right for everyone to claim. The billionaire stood in the quiet, eyes lowered, perhaps wrestling with the realization that his entire worldview had been wrong. And perhaps, in that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. Power wasn't in the money or the control. It was in the ability to see others not as less than you, not as people to be controlled, but as equals. And Marcus had forced Richard, and everyone else in the room, to see him for who he truly was. Marcus nodded at Richard, a simple acknowledgement of the change that had taken place in the room. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, his mother at his side. And as they left the mansion, the sound of their footsteps echoed through the silence left behind. Outside, the cool night air felt different. The stars seemed brighter. Marcus, once just a boy who had been invisible in the eyes of the wealthy, now walked with a quiet confidence that radiated from within. He wasn't just walking out of that mansion. He was walking into the future, into a world that could no longer overlook him, no longer ignore him. He had shown them all that true power didn't lie in wealth or privilege. It lay in dignity. It lay in the courage to stand tall, even when the world told you to shrink. And he knew, in that moment, that nothing, no one could take that from him. As they walked down the driveway, Marcus's mother smiled, the pride in her eyes a reflection of the boy who had become a man right before her eyes. The world would never be the same, and neither would Marcus. The lesson was clear, and it was one he would carry with him forever. Your worth is not defined by the opinions of the powerful. Your worth is defined by the strength of your spirit, the knowledge you carry within, and the dignity with which you walk through the world.